Yeah, so it's Thursday morning, April 10th, 2025. I'm Matt Pierce. And, I get this question a lot. People ask me, they say, Matt, how did you get involved in the oil and gas business? And how did you get involved with the communication side of things? And it's actually a very interesting story. My grandfather was in the oil and gas business. A lot of my family was too. Uh, my grandfather worked for a company called Coastal. Um, had pretty close relationship with Oscar Wyatt and some of the other players there. And so anyway, he was a pipeliner. He worked in the logistics and pipeline side of things. And then my dad, years later, when I was born, was also in the pipeline business and did a lot of work with W.R. Grace and these companies like this. Made a pretty good career for himself in the pipeline industry as well. I chose to go a different route initially. I was not really attracted to that world, to this world. It was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a journalist. I grew up in a really small town in South Texas, Floresville, Texas. Very small rural agriculture town, significant player in the oil patch, especially once fracking came about. And for me, I wanted to do more than just simply go out there and, follow in the same footsteps, be a clone, make a little bit of money, do my thing. That was not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was see the bigger world. I wanted to see the bigger picture. I wanted to see something beyond my own backyard, right? So I found my way into journalism as a photojournalist. And as those of you watching on YouTube and Facebook, you can see this. I keep a lot of photos here handy. And some of these I'm really proud of these photos. They've been on magazine covers and very prestigious magazines. So I started working as a photojournalist, and as a journalist, I really enjoyed this job, really enjoyed it. Took me to places that I never would have imagined, actually. It also opened up doors to people that I never would have imagined. I mean, leaders from all around the world, within oil and gas, within the environmental movement, within politics, government, a lot of these people that I still talk with today, actually, and who opened doors for me into the world of oil and gas and marketing and communications and crisis communications, things like this. So one day I get approached by a guy out of Saudi, knew him pretty well. And he says, "Hey, look, I've done some interviews with him before, done a lot of photos with him before, done a lot of stuff with him before." He approaches me and he says, "Hey, look, you want to work with me? I have this contract in the States. I'm working with some of these people here. I need a negotiator. I need somebody who's going to help me distinguish the fact from fiction of the story." And I said, "Well, you know what? That may not be me. I'm probably not the ideal guy to go to with this. So I'm not a negotiator. I'm not a diplomat, right?" So he comes to me and we're talking about this stuff. And I said, "Sure. You know what? I'll help you." Frankly, he threw a good amount of money at me to work with him on this. So I did. I went to work with him, and it turned out to be a pretty nice situation, pretty nice outcome for everybody. And we had a lot of discussions, and that opened a door to a company out of Incheon, South Korea. And they were looking to buy U.S. natural gas. The problem was the logistics across Mexico, because natural gas gets stolen out of the pipeline, through Mexico. South Korea is a huge consumer of natural gas, and they were looking to buy this Texas natural gas. Well, this company wanted to create some inroads, some partnerships with American companies to try to get this natural gas to them. I said, "Well, I don't know. Maybe we can negotiate something. I don't know." That turned into another job working with them. And, one thing kind of led to another. And somehow I ended up in this role as almost a negotiator, a little bit of a negotiator, a little bit of a buyer, a little bit of a trader, a little bit of a diplomat, a little bit of a crisis communicator. a little bit of all of these things kind of rolled into one, and that turned into what I did. And so then somebody along the line realized that, hey, this son of a bitch worked in the media business for a long time, right? So they started hiring me to make content for them, for these companies, which was great. That was right in my wheelhouse. I really enjoyed making content, doing photos, doing videos, doing press releases, stuff like this. And then, of course, that led to me talking to media outlets on their behalf, understanding the stories, because they understood that I had a good way of dealing with the media because I was in that world for a long time. So I dealt with the media, I dealt with the press, dealt with the companies, tried to understand their problems when the leftist environmental groups were coming at them. We had to explain to them, the media, our side, and point out that, what, these leftists are doing this or saying this. Well, here's the reality. A lot of it's controlling the narrative, right? And I hate to make this about leftist versus right winger or whatever, but it's true. The world we live in is a very political world. So a lot of times I would use this diplomacy with the media to try to say, hey, look, you know what? The people that are complaining are actually doing just as bad as these guys, if not worse. And here's the proof. And here's why. So this is what I started doing. I started doing this communications with these groups, partly, like I said, because I was relatable to them. I understood how they thought. I understood how they worked. And it became a very lucrative, I'm going to say lucrative, but it became a very interesting job for me, to say the least. It did, for sure. And, so I kind of blended my practical knowledge of oil and gas into my practical knowledge of the media, politics, government, how this stuff works, how it all kind of comes together. This was my inroad to this. And for me, it opened my eyes to a totally different side of things that I didn't always understand completely. I didn't always get the philosophy. I didn't always understand. I didn't understand the geopolitics of it, right? I just simply understood the very surface level of the political, domestic politics, society, how people think. Because at the end of the day, I'm a student of sociology, a student of how people think, their migrations, their habits, what they consume, what they, put out, all this other stuff, You have to be a student of this to be a good, effective human interest journalist. For myself, that's what I was always interested in. So I started applying that to both the oil and gas industry and to the environmental industry, which is exactly what it is. It's an environmental industry. And sometimes, yes, it does seem like you're playing the two cards off of each other. And sometimes that's what you have to do, especially in communications. But with my job in particular, it's more about saying, hey, look, this is what these people are complaining about, and accusing my client of doing, well, they're no different, And for me personally, I learned that this was one part theatrics and one part common sense, right? And I remember one time I was in a lecture and I was listening to a very, very well-respected Texas attorney. He's from Texas, and Dick DeGuerin. And I was listening to him talk, and he said, it doesn't matter whether you never put your client on trial, right? Put the Constitution on trial, put the police on trial, put the DA on trial, put the, whoever on trial, but never put your client on trial. And as a communications person, you realize that's a lot of what you're doing is you're controlling who goes on trial, what issue goes on trial. You're controlling that. And sometimes there's a lot of responsibility and a lot of weight that goes with that. A lot. And sometimes people don't realize that, but it's true. So my job is partly walking a tightrope between fact and fiction. And sometimes you're representing people that are wrong, and they know they're wrong. And sometimes you just have to meet that head on. You have to meet that face to face. You have to just admit when you're wrong, admit when you screwed up, and move on from it. One thing I've learned in this whole thing is when you admit when you're wrong, people are quick to forgive. People have a short memory. They have a really short memory. Humans do in general. And even though the internet's still going to be there, you can always figure out a way around whatever's there, or, whatever. But it's true. People have a short memory and they're quick to forgive. When you accept responsibility, when you accept your role in this, people are pretty quick to forgive you. It's when you start justifying it and you start playing the victim and you start, playing, well, I'm being screwed over. Somebody's out to get me, blah, 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 blah. That's when people lose respect for you. Even if you're right. Sometimes I tell my airline clients, early on in an accident, because I work not a lot, but I work a good amount with the airlines. And when there's an incident or a crash or something like that, sometimes it's best just to accept responsibility early on, right out of the box. You can hash it out in court later. If you find out that the problem is with Boeing or with Airbus or whatever, hash that out in court later. Accept responsibility early. Take responsibility, even if it's not your fault. Then you can play the victim. You can then play the victim. Sometimes it's just best. That's the best damage control. You're not going to get to play the victim early on, but you'll get to play the victim card later. And sometimes it's best to keep that victim card in your pocket, especially from a communication standpoint, especially from a PR standpoint. And that's something a lot of people don't realize. Yeah, it's something that a lot of people don't know. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about, is keeping the victim card in your back pocket. Don't use it right off the bat, because that can be a real problem for you, a huge problem for you. So my job is helping these clients, 1, negotiate, 2, get their message across, 3, help them to put out the best public image they possibly can in a world that's constantly out to get them, in a world that's constantly out to make them look foolish, and to also paint the adversary as an adversary, and then find some middle ground and focus on that middle ground. Sometimes that's a very complicated thing to do, a very, very, very complicated thing to do. Like, I am under no illusion. Let's take fracking, for instance. I'm under no illusion that fracking is a shitty process. It's a horrible process for the environment. It's a horrible process for the people that work around this stuff. Half of them don't even realize it. They're just doing it because it's a paycheck, right? And a good paycheck. Fracking contributes to earthquakes. There's no doubt about that. We know this. There's a lot of negatives to fracking. But on the flip side of that, what alternative do you have? There's not a lot of alternatives out there. And the world still needs a lot of gas. The world still needs a lot of natural gas. The world still needs a lot of oil. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Do you have a reasonable alternative? They're not making batteries to the quality that we need to make them for. And by the way, those batteries still need energy to run. Do you have a reasonable solution? And that's how you control the narrative. And that's how you change the tide. And that's how you change the conversation. The average person probably can't do that too effectively. It ends up doing more harm than good, because you always want to run and play the victim card, or you always want to run and play the sales card, or you always want to try to defend yourself. Sometimes you just have to understand there's a time and a place to defend yourself, and now might not be the time to do it. It has to be later on. Sometimes when you're working with these people, and, a lot of times I'll get called by attorneys. A lot of times attorneys will call me and they'll say, look, I need you to help me prepare my client for a deposition or to go on trial or whatever. I need you to question the hell out of them. I'll do that. I'll question the hell out of them, try to establish the facts. I'll come in and play the role of the adversary, and prepare them for what they're going to face. Because I have been questioned by some very tough people in my life. Some very, very, very tough people. And if they'll admit, I am probably one of the more difficult people that they've ever dealt with, because I just shoot straight with them. And sometimes that's what it takes. Sometimes you'd rather have me working for you than against you. And that's a fact. I may look like shit sometimes. You may not trust me. You may not like me. But I can be either your best friend or your worst enemy. And that depends on how I personally feel about you. Really. And I can frustrate the hell out of somebody to no end. Man, I can frustrate the living hell out of somebody. I have gotten under the skin of some pretty powerful people pretty quickly, because I come into it with a negotiation. I come into it with a narrative. I come into it with an idea. I come into it with facts. And you're going to ask the questions. I'm going to be straightforward with you. I'm going to shoot straightforward with you. I'm going to tell you the way it is. You may not like it. And I'm going to strip every single defense that you possibly have. I'm going to strip that away from you and I'm going to use it against you. And that's a very strong tactic. And in the end, if you beat me, then we had a good fight. Let's walk away friends. Let's have a steak, And you realize pretty quickly that that's the kind of personality you want to have on your side, especially in communications and PR. Is sometimes you need an adversary to work with you. And that's a very, very complicated thing for people to understand, is that sometimes you just need an adversary to work with you, not against you. And you need to convince that adversary to come over to your side. It doesn't bother me. It does not bother me to, have to work with somebody. It does not bother me to have to, defend somebody who I don't necessarily agree with. It doesn't, because sometimes even those people have a voice. I always tell people I'm a pretty firm libertarian. And they ask me, they say, well, what does that mean? And I say, well, I may not agree with what you're saying. I may not agree with your position, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That's a libertarian. That is a libertarian at its core. I may not agree with, and sometimes that's the thought process you need in order to make things work. You may not agree with what they're saying, but you defend their right and you agree with their right to say it, however it is. So that's the interesting thing about this. So the way that I got into this business was simply by making friends with enemies and making enemies of friends. And sometimes that's not a good place to be, and sometimes it's a great place to be. It just depends, because when you see the world from this middle ground, from this middle of the road, it helps you from being so jaded, and B, it gets to the truth of the matter, because not everybody is as guilty as they seem, and not everybody is as innocent as they seem. In the middle is the truth, and that's how we play this game. In the middle is the truth, and sometimes you just have to walk a tightrope. Public relations and communications, especially in this world that we live in, is a tightrope. It really is. So anyway, I hope that helped you. That's some background on me in my life. And, I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I do hope that I'm at least the most common sense guy in the room sometimes when it has to be. There's obviously a lot of people who are much smarter than I am. And, and I'm always here to help people, to consult with them, to talk with them, to go to bat for them, even if I disagree with them, because they have a right to defend themselves, and they have a right to defend their position, and they have a right to do this game as much as anybody else does. And I'm always here to help somebody do that. And in the court of public opinion, and in the court of, the way that people see things, you need a good communications person on your side. And that's how I got into communications. That's how I got into corporate communications, crisis communications, industrial communications. That's how I got into it, because sometimes you need somebody to think a little bit differently. I'm Matt. This has been the Matt Pierce Podcast. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you in the next episode. I really appreciate it. And by the way, if you want to be a sponsor of this podcast, where we talk about all sorts of things, man. We talk about oil and gas. We talk about life. We talk about travel. We talk about strategy. We talk about all kinds of things, because it just, whatever basically pops into my mind today, we're going to talk about it, because that's how random conversations happen. So anyway, please leave me a comment, a review, whatever. I'd really love it. Thanks a lot. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.